for me personally. And I'm sure there are plenty of other folks online here that would say the same. But this isn't actually a question we can reasonably answer on behalf of anyone else. And so why isn't there an obvious answer? The answer isn't obvious because, like a lot of things in life, increasing our level of involvement with open source communities comes with both potential benefits and potential downsides. And even if our answer is a clear yes or no right now, the balance between the benefits and downsides may change over time. So it's a question that's worth keeping in the back of our minds, even after we've been actively participating for years, or decades, as the case may be. So today, I'm going to briefly review several of those drawbacks and potential benefits, and grouping them into the following categories. So challenges, personal resource management issues that just can't be avoided. Hazards, problems that apply to different degrees in different communities. Misconceptions, concerns we may have that aren't genuinely true. And opportunities, the counterbalances that may make it all worthwhile. Before we continue though, I should clarify the scope of what I'm talking about today. What do I mean by open source? I'm not using open source in the strict copyright licensing sense. Instead, I'm using it in the broader sense of primarily online creative endeavors, where the central focus is a shared piece of software. A lot of it applies to volunteering and collaborative communities in general, but I'm approaching it specifically from a software perspective, and some of the details do reflect that. So, the first category of challenges, or first category of downsides that I think are worth considering, are those that genuinely can't be avoided, only managed. More specifically, these challenges are about deciding how much of a limited personal resource we want to devote to participation in open source communities. And there are two such challenges that I want to highlight today, as they're ones that are going to come up repeatedly, even as we consider other topics. And the first is time. There's only so many hours in the day, and everyone involved in open source projects has other commitments to juggle, even paid contributors. Our availability for open source contributions will vary over time, and only we can decide how we want to prioritize those contributions relative to everything else we might be doing instead. And then the second is emotional energy. Participation in open source projects almost inevitably involves human interaction. That may be a matter of working directly with other people, or it may be more indirect, such as dealing with cases where another project we rely on decided to make a backwards incompatible change that causes additional work for us. Or sometimes maybe we're the ones making that decision that causes work for others because we think it's a better choice for the community in the long run. The more involved we get, the more direct and indirect relationships we're likely to build, and the more emotional energy we may need to devote to maintaining them. Now, the second category that I think is worth considering is what I call hazards. These are problems that are still somewhat inevitable, but the frequency with which we encounter them can vary greatly depending on which open source projects we decide to actively participate in. Now, there are two key reasons I consider these behaviors worth reflecting on. Firstly, so we're not caught by surprise if we encounter them as open source contributors ourselves. Secondly, though, it's so we can watch for these behaviors appearing in our own actions and try to avoid being the ones making participation less enjoyable for others. There's a huge range of open source out there, from small personal hobby projects to industrial scale institutional collaborations that power the internet and more. Users will sometimes approach open source projects as if they're all massive projects like the Linux kernel. And sometimes they'll even demand levels of support that paying customers of the likes of Microsoft, Google, and Apple don't even get. As tempting as it may be sometimes, that isn't a reasonable thing for anyone to do. And this hazard of excessive user entitlement is near enough to my heart that it gets a second slide. This software is provided by the copyright holders and contributors as is, and any express or implied warranties, including, but not limited to, the implied warranties of merchantability and fitness for a particular purpose, are disclaimed. Now, that specific disclaimer comes from the 3-clause BSD license, but most open source licenses include a clause that starts something like this. Software is provided as is. Fitness for purpose is disclaimed. When we choose to use open source tools to solve our problems, the responsibility for making that work in our specific situation remains with us. There are a lot of open source communities that are substantially more helpful to their users than that, since we do want our users to be successful in what they're attempting to do. So the hazard is when we cross the line from appreciating that support when it's available to instead feeling entitled to that support when it falls short. And I mentioned this hazard first, specifically because for anyone that does decide to get more actively involved in open source communities, it's a critical detail for us to keep in mind to help shore up our emotional energy when resisting unreasonable demands on our time. Now, corporations and other organizations publish open source for a lot of reasons. The ones who do it well set intentionally different expectations for things like availability and responsiveness when it comes to their paid colleagues versus their volunteer contributors. Unfortunately, many organizations don't do it well and may try to place entirely unrealistic expectations on their volunteers. Enforcing our boundaries in those kinds of cases is a double whammy that consumes both time and emotional energy. And even if we choose to disengage from the offending project, our memories of those poor experiences don't simply go away. At the same time, the flip side of that is that projects do get to set their own rules for accepting contributions. If we think those conditions are too onerous, then the simplest reasonable response on our part is to choose not to contribute further to that project. Now, sometimes, if we're already too invested in the project to want to walk away, it can also be reasonable to take the time to understand exactly why the requirements are the way they are, and perhaps look for alternative approaches that achieve the same goals while needing less work, specifically by human contributors. Automation's great. What isn't reasonable for us, though, is to harass the maintainers enforcing their various quality control and project maintainability processes in an attempt to get them to lower their acceptance standards just so they're easier for us to meet. So, quality controls exist for a reason. That brings us to the catch-all hazard of generally toxic behavior. Open source projects aren't magically immune to bad behavior. Communities believing that they are is itself a concerning sign. Although many of them are just genuinely small groups of like-minded folks that have been lucky enough not to encounter a notable interpersonal conflict yet. More generally, though, racism, sexism, and other flavors of discrimination are not truly solved problems anywhere. People are gonna people. There are, however, known techniques to mitigate them, so we can specifically look for communities that not only demonstrate awareness of these techniques, but also put them into practice through things like publishing well-defined codes of conduct with a demonstrated track record of both following them by default and then actually enforcing them when necessary. Alternatively, we may decide we do want to take on one of those smaller, less structured communities, just because it resonates with us personally. And sometimes that'll work out. After all, it's folks taking a chance on those smaller communities that lets them grow into larger ones in the first place. You guessed it, though, this is yet another hazard that can sap both time and energy as we look for environments that appeal to us. That all paints a pretty dire picture, though, doesn't it? With all these downsides, why would anyone ever want to get more involved? So it's time to start looking at the happier side of the equation, starting with some misconceptions that might lead us to incorrectly conclude that more active contribution or more active involvement isn't for us. Now, I'm not good enough. Folks sometimes make the assumption that open source contributions require a vast amount of skill or experience. And that simply isn't true. It may take some investigation to find projects with tasks that align with both our interests and our skills. but almost every project has open issues that are amenable to straightforward solutions. And just in need of the time with someone with both the time and inclination to actually do something about it. So when we're looking for opportunities to contribute, it can also be a good idea to specifically seek out projects that are actively encouraging involvement from new contributors, especially if we can look at past interactions on that project and see positive experiences for newcomers making their first contributions. And another misconception we sometimes have is thinking we have to be perfect before we get started. And I've been talking quite a bit about problematic behaviors we may encounter in our community interactions. And so that can kind of strengthen this fear that we may be excluded based on one mistake. And in the healthier communities, there's a clear distinction made between honest mistakes and problematic patterns of behavior. In these communities, mistakes are seen as an inevitable consequence of learning new things. And that applies to social interactions just as much as it does to technical details. The key point is being able to recognize that we don't do that here isn't intended as a personal attack. It's a gentle correction aimed at adjusting potentially problematic behavior before it has a chance to become a pattern. Another misconception we sometimes hold is just believing that there aren't any interesting problems left to resolve, so we don't go looking. Python had already been popular in numeric computing for years before it finally gained a native matrix multiplication operator. That happened because someone went, hey, here's an idea we haven't tried yet. We should consider it. Async programming concepts were covered by third-party projects in Python for years before they became a native part of the language itself. An installation client for third-party packages wasn't added to the default CPython installs until the Python package index had already been around for years. Again, this got resolved because folks had the time and inclination to make it happen. The interesting problems may not be obvious, and what's interesting to each of us is going to be different. But there are lots of open source projects out there that are essentially never going to be finished in any real sense, as the world around them that they need to interact with is continuously changing. And so, yeah, new issues come up constantly. So, and then sometimes there are just old issues that nobody's had the time to tackle before. But not everyone loves programming as a hobby or even as a job. At least some open source communities do recognize the value and difficulty of creating good documentation, tutorials, and other materials, and welcome contributors that want to focus on those. Documentation is also an area where deep expertise can be a hindrance rather than help, as it's incredibly easy for experts to forget just how much true beginners don't know yet. Beyond documentation, larger communities may also operate significant infrastructure projects or have various communication forums that need moderation. Events like this one that we're all participating in now don't happen without substantial efforts behind the scenes from the organizers and other volunteers. And the final misconception I want to look at is the idea that only online interactions matters. It's like, while the internet's an amazing communications tool, there's always going to be something special about in-person interactions. For some folks, creating those spaces for in-person meetings, whether they be local community meetups or regional, national, and international conferences, is something that gives them immense satisfaction. And now, finally, we're here. We've been through several reasons. Our answer to the question in this talk's title might legitimately be no, and a few that might erroneously push our thinking in that direction. So what opportunities are there that might tempt us to actually say, yes, I do want to get more involved in open source? Well, one of the first and biggest ones is sometimes we use a software tool that we mostly like, but there's something about it that just deeply irritates us. Maybe it's a bug we regularly run into, a missing feature we wish it had, or some documentation that irks us every time we read it. When it's an open source project and the situation bothers us enough, we can choose to invest the time and energy needed to actually resolve the situation that is annoying us. Even if our proposed solution isn't accepted, we may at least learn a better explanation for why things are the way they are, and that can sometimes genuinely make it less annoying. So, and that's just a specific instance of the fact that Being actively involved in an open source project provides extensive opportunities to learn from the other people involved. Our involvement may also provide motivation to learn about things in our own time that we may otherwise have never explored. For myself, as a largely monolingual English speaker, I wouldn't know anywhere near as much about Unicode and other text encoding mechanisms I do now if it wasn't for being part of the Python 3 language migration, as we discovered that Python 2's handling of text outside the basic English Latin alphabet was even more broken than we initially realized it was. So, and this benefit is somewhat dependent on the specific projects we're involved in, because not all projects get the credit they may deserve when they're part of making things happen. But yeah, joy in the achievement of others, the Buddhist word for it being mudita. Yeah, this one is one of my own sources of joy, is learning when folks are doing cool things, especially in research science or education, that Python helped make possible. Helping someone else make their first contribution to a project they help maintain is also often more satisfying than implementing a new feature or bug fix myself. And for those involved in organizing meetups and larger events, seeing first-time presenters realize that, yes, this is something they can do is itself genuinely rewarding, as is the opportunity to bring people together that might otherwise have never had the chance to meet in person. So yeah, this one's special. Now, work portfolios. On its own, I don't actually consider this to be a good reason to get more involved in open source. I just don't believe it's reliably effective enough to justify the commitment of time and emotional energy needed. Other contributors also aren't likely to react well if they feel that we're just trying to look good to future employers instead of genuinely trying to be helpful. And if employers actively treat evidence of past active open source participation as a requirement for potential employees, that's just got huge indirect discrimination problems on the employer side. If we're interested for other reasons, though, there are definitely potential professional benefits to be gained from developing a publicly reviewable body of work through our involvement in open source projects. I've benefited enough from that myself. It would have been outright hypocritical for me to skip pointing this out as a potential benefit. More generally, though, links between potential employers and potential employees are just one of the many kinds of relationship that may form. Open source projects consist primarily of different groups of people, and many projects have off-topic spaces, both online and offline, where folks may chat about things other than the project. And given enough time and attention, these connections can grow into being not just those of friendly acquaintances, but actual friendships. And on that note, since this is a Python conference, there's one off-quoted line that I'm going to finish with. In his opening remarks at PyCon 2014 in Montreal, Brett Cannon made the observation he first came to Python because he was interested in the language, but he remained an active participant due to the community around the language. Open source projects are nominally each about a different piece of software. When we consider getting more involved, it can seem like a daunting prospect. And there are absolutely potential downsides to be legitimately concerned about. Ultimately, though, the projects that become the active, thriving communities that are the most fun to be part of, those are about the people, and it's those positive interactions that really make the expenditure of our time and energy feel thoroughly worthwhile. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, for your talk. It's very inspiring and a great reminder to start where we are with what we have. I particularly like what you said about us not having to be very perfect to start contributing to open source. But I did have a question though, just to take your brain on what you have seen amongst other people, right?
Yep.
What do you think are the real reasons why people think they're not good enough to contribute to open source?
Whoa. So many.
Yeah.
So I think part of it is just that we're constantly bombarded with messaging around stay in your lane, let the experts deal with it. This is too complicated for you. And often those messages are coming from people with a vested interest in not having a tech-savvy consumer base. They would prefer people not to be peeking behind the curtain. And so yeah, I think a part of it is just that, yeah, we're constantly exposed to messages that say, this is not for you. This is somebody else's problem. You should just be a passive consumer and not an active participant.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. We have one last question and then we can close this session. The question is, what key features or elements would you suggest that beginners look for when trying to find a project to contribute to?
So the first and foremost, I would say, look for your own intrinsic motivation. Like, I got into Python core development just because I had fun on the old Lang Python news group talking about stupid stuff in Python. And like, one of my first contributions was making the timeit module easier to run from the command line, because we would do stupid micro benchmarks, and it was just annoying how hard it was to run the timeit module. It's much easier now. But without that intrinsic motivation of actually enjoying it, everything else stems from that. Like if you're devoting your personal time to something, you have to be getting an intrinsic reward from it. But the other one is some of the stuff I was looking at of, if bad interactions do happen, will that community support you? And it's just, and so that's things like, do they have a code of conduct? Are the codes of conduct accepted, or are they mocked? Is there a history of like incident management? Like, establishing a code of conduct is step one, but actually maintaining it and using it effectively is an ongoing challenge. So yeah, and then, but it is the case of, yeah, communities that understand that communities are hard and need maintenance are a good thing to look for.
All right. Well, we've come to the end of this keynote session. Thank you so much, Alyssa, for joining us this year at PyLadies Con 2025. I know that all you shared is definitely going to inspire beginners to find their place in open source, to come in with the skills that they have and then find their place within the open source ecosystem. So thank you once again for sharing. And everybody, thank you so much as well for watching. Stay tuned for the upcoming sessions. Thank you.
And I'll be in Discord.